Okay, so we're lucky to have a wonderful panel. Tommaso is not going to be on the panel because she may have to leave a bit earlier, but we are delighted to have Kosuke AOKI, Ester FAIA, and now SUDO, who are going to talk about a subset of the topics for this panel, where the questions, as they like to address them, are the issues raised by much higher, longer-term interest rates in the US due to higher inflation, and the policy concerns that this creates for yield curve control in Japan, consequences of differing inflation rates in advanced economies and the implications for policymakers, differential inflation expectations across countries, whether these are due to different experiences or different expectations formation processes. The role of quantitative easing in the inflation run-up, whether we should see a causal link between unconventional monetary policies and the current inflationary episode, the policy responses to differential inflation rates between sectors, as well as consumer and producer prices, and lastly, whether this time's inflation that we are observing mostly around the globe is new. That is there anything that we don't understand about the current episode based on what we learned in the past, if any? We will go alphabetically. Thus, we are lucky to have Kosuke AOKI to give the first talk on these topics.
Okay, so thank you very much. And let me share my screen. So it's a great opportunity to participate in this panel session. Okay, and so this is the I will make it smaller to fit everything. Okay, so those are the 5 topics Refet gave us. Okay, and I'm going to talk about 3 of those 5 questions. The first one, so much higher inflation, much higher long-term interest rates in the United States and yield curve control in Japan, and different inflation expectations across countries, and different experiences or different expectation formation processes. Okay, and the fourth one, the role of QE. Actually, I'm not going to talk about QE, but more broadly speaking, unconventional monetary policy, in particular forward guidance and higher inflation. Okay, and let me talk about the yield curve. Okay, so this chart is from a major publication of the Bank of Japan. Okay, so this shows you the Japanese yield curves. And you see, so the horizontal line is years, and the vertical axis is the percentage point of interest rates. And you can see there's a decline here. Okay, so this is 10-year EUs. And as many of you know, the BOJ's yield curve control targets 10-year yield. Okay. So the next one compares the Japanese yield curve with that of the United States and Germany. Okay. So there are several interesting differences. So first of all, the levels are very different. So Japanese interest rate is very, very low compared with those of the United States. So you can see the vertical lines, okay, and Germany. Okay. And also you can see that, well, according to the yield curve, people expect that interest rate is going to be very low in the earlier periods, but it's going to be higher. But still, for 30-year yield is about 1% or 2%. Okay. And compare with that of Japan in the United States, high interest rates recently, but it's almost flat. Okay. And the same is true for Germany. So somewhat lower than the interest rate of the United States, but it's flat. Okay. So those are different character properties of expectations about long-term interest rates. Okay. And you can see how the high inflation rates or high interest rates of the United States put some difficulty on the Bank of Japan's yield curve control by looking at the simple economic model. Okay. So 4 equations. The first one is the time structure of the interest rate, which is very well known. So the left-hand side is long rate. Let me think about the Japanese interest rate. Japanese long rate is the average of expected short rates today and future. And since we're talking about the 10-year yield, 10-year yield has some convenience premium. And the BOJ's YCC affects this term rather than the first term. By buying a lot of Japanese JGB from the markets, the BOJ tries to lower this convenience yield. Okay, so that's the first one. And UIP, so this connects the US interest rate, which is our star, and Japanese interest rate, and exchange rate appreciation or depreciation. Okay, so epsilon is the UIP shock. So as long as you can, so if you look at those two equations, the first one and the second one, you can see that when the US interest rate increases, you may see either the increase in Japanese long rate or exchange rate depreciation. Okay? But when the exchange rate, so we do see exchange rate depreciation of the Japanese yen against the dollar. Okay? But this puts somewhat an inflationary pressure through the pass-through of exchange rate depreciation to inflation. Okay? And when, well, the BOJ hasn't done yet, but as long as inflation increases, well, then naturally, people expect that monetary policy is going to be expansionary. Okay? So when the US rate becomes higher, then either through UIP or through exchange rate depreciation and the BOJ's response to inflation, you have an increase in interest rate, a future interest rate. Okay? And the short rate of the Japanese short rate is already at the lower bound. So therefore, as long as you have some floor on the convenience yield, it's not so easy to control the long-term interest rates. Okay, so that's what I think is what's going on of the relationship between YCC and US interest rate. Okay. And the second topic, okay, so different expectations. So here I want to cite or call attention to an interesting survey study of Professor Tsutomu Watanabe of the University of Tokyo. Okay. So this is a survey question across in 5 countries. Okay. And the first question is the following: what do you think will happen to prices over the next year compared to today? So survey is conducted in 2021 and April 2022. And let me talk about Japan, which looks very different from the other countries. Okay. And into August 2021, not many people answer that price will increase a lot. Okay. But after April 2022, more and more people started answering that prices will increase a lot. Okay. So here until before the COVID or before 2021, not many people expect that prices in Japan will increase, and that was one of the difficulties, very hard difficulties that BOJ was facing. Very stubborn inflation, low inflation expectations. Okay. But things may have changed if you look at the new survey. Okay. And the second interesting question is the following: suppose that the price of a product that you will always buy in your supermarket goes by 10%. And what would you do? So that's a question. Again, look at Japan. In August 2021, many people answer that I will switch to a supermarket, to a different supermarket. So therefore, this may be one of the reasons for why Japanese firms were so reluctant to increase the prices, because they're very worried that once they increase the prices, customers will run away. And this 55% number is very, very high, much higher than the other numbers of the other countries. Okay. But in April 2022, again, the situation might have changed because the number of people, the ratio of the people who answer that I will switch to a different supermarket decreased quite a lot, and now comparable to the other countries. So judging from that, we may see some increase we may see that Japanese firms may start increasing their prices because they feel safer to increase their prices. Okay, so that's second one. And the third one, sorry, this is topic 4. Okay, so the role of policy. And I'd like to mention something about the overshooting commitment the central banks have made. Okay? So the BOJ was actively using its forward guidance policy. And one of the statements is the so-called overshooting commitment, which is done in 2016. Okay? And the bank says that we are going to continue monetary easing until CPI inflation exceeds 2% and stay above in a stable manner. Okay? And the Fed made a similar commitment, but in terms of average inflation target, and which was made in 2020. And well, this is a rather long sentence, so let me just say the following. Okay? So following period when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, then appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation above 2% for some time. So those are overshooting commitments. And if they were successful, well, people expect that central banks may tolerate high inflation. Okay? So therefore, well, it may be too early to judge whether this commitment was responsible or not, but I think this is going to be an interesting research topic we have to examine. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kosuke. And now we're lucky to have Ester back.
Thanks, Refet. So thanks again for having me both in the presentation and in the panel. So I haven't prepared any slides for this, also because I didn't want to overshoot already with my very long presentation. And I will only make 3 remarks. Actually, somewhat, I mean, hearing Kosuke, very thoughtful remark, I think somewhat mine are related. They are, also independent from my previous presentation and partly related to, the results that I know from that. So first of all, in terms of development over time of inflation, while, we see both demand and supply shocks, contrary to the 70s, in which we mainly had an oil price shocks. I would say that, also Kosuke's lies and surveys and plots shows that contrary to the 70s, nowadays, the concern of firms in forming inflation expectation, but also prices, is very much more related to competition. So how consumers switch across competitors and whether there is a coordination with other competitors. So Kosuke clearly mentioned that, to the point in which firms were worried that that consumers would antagonize and would switch to another competitor, they were not raising prices. But the moment that all competitors were doing the same things, then they did not fear any longer the increase in prices. My hunch is that energy prices, of course, we will have to get more research and more evidence on this, that energy prices they are a concern because of the Ukrainian war and many other reasons, but they are less of a concern than in the 70s for the very simple reason that in the 70s, there was only one source of energy. And so there was no option out of that, while now, of course, technology and different type of energy sources make this connection between inflation and energy prices less relevant. One thing which I believe, but again, this we will gather evidence over time, that it may be overlooked is the wage inflation spiral. The typical argument that people were putting forward is that, well, it's not like in the 70s in which unions were continuously indexing on inflation. Well, I don't know how it is in your own country, but my own the country where I live has been indexed everything and is starting to index again. So, in the 70s, it was written in old statute that unions had to index inflation into the wages. This was deleted around the 80s. First of all, in some countries like Italy, it was back. A few years ago, the Renzi government had reintroduced indexation. So this is by statute, it's by law, it is automatic. The other thing is that in most countries, including the United States, Germany, France, of course, the initial inflation trigger, voice from the unions who asked for indexation. They got the indexation, and most economists would say, oh, you will see, it will only be temporary. They will only renegotiate once. The point is that they are starting to claim a new renegotiation. And it will be very, very difficult, with 10% inflation, to deny the fact that to lower, to lower income workers, you do not renegotiate the 10%. So I think with the time, we might have to reconsider the role of the wage inflation spiral. The third comment, I'm not really an expert of yield curve, mostly with the giants that are in the audience, including Refet. So I don't know if I can say much. Certainly the role of expectations is important for the yield curve. I actually, looking at Kosuke presentation, there was one thing that made me think, it has been well known, but actually this might explain much of the differences in inflation developments across countries, which is the convenience yield. So, still now the dollars has a very huge convenience yield. The Swiss franc and the euro have a convenience yield relatively to the yen and to other currencies. And so this may feed into the expectations of agents and eventually affects inflation. And another thing that, came to my mind before is that, well, probably if I want to guess something about what investors or households or firms expect about the development of interest rate into the future, we have to look a little bit at their investment decisions. The fact, typically, even, during hyperinflation episodes, you see people shying away from cash and moving into housing. And this is already what we are seeing now. At least in Europe, we are seeing this. And so this may tell you a lot about what they expect, how interest rates will be going into the future.
Insightful as ever. Thank you. And I think some of the indexation issue also touches upon Tommaso's paper and his presentation, where we want to make sure that the workers are not the sector that is shouldering the burden of inflation. But then we don't want this to turn into an inflationary spiral either. And therefore, somebody has to worry about the distributional consequences. And that somebody probably is not the central bank. Now, on a unrelated note, actually, I'd appreciate it very much if in the second round, you talk a little bit about the policy implication of your research, where now that we have a better understanding of how firms form their inflation expectations, if a well-meaning central bank and government want to work on those expectations, what are the channels? What are the options they have available to them? When I come back to you, I hope that you'll say a few words about that. With that, we turn to our third panelist, Dr. SUDO. The floor is yours.
Thank you again. So again, usual disclaimer applies. So I would like to first echo what Kosuke had just said. So I'm going to mention the third question about the differential inflation expectations. So the BOJ has conducted assessment of the effort of monetary policy easing twice, one in 2016 and the other in 2021. And clearly how households from their inflation expectation is something to be studied carefully. And the graph below is taken from the report regarding the second assessment disseminated in 2021. And the slide intends to compare how inflation expectation 1 year ahead responds to a change in the lagged actual inflation for US, Japan, Euro, and UK. And the parameter of non-interest is theta, which is the coefficient attached to the observed lagged inflation. And it is seen that theta is large for Japan relative to other countries, possibly indicating that pass-through from the actual lagged inflation to the inflation expectation is more sluggish in this country. And the estimation use core inflation rates, by the way, as observed inflation rates. It is possible that the theta is not really a structural parameter, but changes over time. But in the two assessments, one 2016 and one 2021, the theta barely changes. But even if changes in inflation expectation takes more time, it doesn't mean that the inflation expectation doesn't change for good. It is just a matter of time. And I think more important issue is not the pace, but the magnitude. But we see actually, as Kosuke has just said, changes in household expectation. So this slide here shows the changes in household expectations that I used in the discussion with Professor FAIA's paper. One is the one based on the survey conducted in 2019 when inflation was very, very low. And in 2022, and inflation expectation was actually went up from 4% to 8%. Now I'm going to mention about the question 5. What is new in inflation this time, and what is it that we don't know? Because this question can be split into two parts. I'd like to first respond to the first part of the question. So I think there are two important differences between the 1970s and today, and those differences could make the emergence of great inflation less unlikely. First, and most importantly, we already learned from the lesson from the 1970s. So Ed Nelson once said that for the great inflation for the US, that there is a considerable degree of agreement amongst economists that the great inflation can be traced to the provision of what was an excessive amount of aggregate demand, and that these aggregate demand settings are in some part attributable to what was an overly easy monetary policy. And this slide here is taken from Ito 2013, and he points out that CPI inflation rate was already around 10% several months before the Middle East crisis, due mainly to the accommodative policy stances. And he further argues that policy rate was raised in 1973. The real interest rate measured by the official discount rate and CPI inflation was indeed negative. But against this background, BOJ increased in the latter half of 1970, the policy rate so that the real interest rate was positive and inflation rate was contained. Second observation we have is the real R-star, the real interest rate. So before the pandemic, we had a period of low for long where policy rate in advanced countries was set at a low rate. And this slide shows the estimate of R-star for Japan based on several different methodologies, including that of Labaha and Williams. These estimates agree that R-star had been declining over the years. And I do not show here, but there are also estimates for other countries. For example, those by Houston, Labaha, and Williams. And they also agree that natural rate of interest declined gradually to a level, and most notably after the global financial crisis. So of course, the being a low rate before the pandemic doesn't mean that the rate will be low after the pandemic. But there are several works that address the linkages between R-star or the real interest rate and the flexible price and changes in demographic, including the work of Professor Fujiwara. And the panels here show there the average life expectancy for the United States and Japan at the right, and the impact of longevity on the real interest rate computed from an standard basic plain vanilla overlapping generation model. And we see that life expectancy increases around 70 during the 1970s to around 75 in the United States and 85 for Japan. So people live longer in nowadays. And the similar observation holds for other G7 countries. And again, based on a standard OZIM model, if you know you live longer, you accumulate the saving more that results in lower real interest rate. So if this force is translated into our STIR, then low for long should prevail going forward as well. Now I come to the second part of the question. What is it that we don't understand, if any? So I think we should continue learning about how inflation expectation is formed by households, firms, and possibly by participants of financial market. So these slides are taken from Hazel, Bernardo, Nakamura, and Steinson. So you can see that CPI and expectation inflation at the left, and the variation of inflation attributed to variations in gap at the right. And the key takeaway from these panels is that quantitatively, inflation expectation was really, really important during the 1970s. And I think, therefore, the research outcomes like the one we saw today really serve as a valuable input to the policymakers going ahead. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Very much thanks to you. And we're going to have a second round where all panelists are shortly going to talk again. And you're more than welcome and encouraged to comment on each other's initial round comments, but also touch upon other topics too. So we go back to Dr. Aoki.
Right. Thank you very much. So both Ester's presentation and our presentations are very exciting and interesting. And actually, I wanted to add one question on topic 5, which is what is new in inflation this time. Okay. And well, I don't have a slide for this one, but it's not really about inflation, but policy response, what we should do or what we can do. So I think that difference between the 70s and now is the level of government debt. And this is very true for the Japanese economy. And as Tommaso says, well, monetary policy has fiscal implications. And monetary tightening often means that, well, there's a transfer from the public to private agents in the form of interest payments. So therefore, as long as interest payments are increasing, that's going to be expansionary by nature. Okay. So therefore, in order to be neutral, you have to increase negative transfer, which is taxes. But a tiny, well, yeah, imagine we have in Japan, we have huge amount of debt compared with GDP. And tiny increase interest rate increases massively interest payments. So therefore, we cannot really follow the policy. Well, we may not be able to follow the standard policy prescriptions that is suggested in the 70s, which is to increase interest rate a lot. And I don't know, to be honest, by myself, I don't know what's going to, what should be the right policy mix of the monetary tightening and fiscal tightening for Japan and also for other countries. And if you have any views, I would be very welcome to listen.
Let me ask you a question, Kosuke,
Sure.
on whether this is undesirable ex ante, in the sense that, you know, there's a reason why the debt to GDP in Japan is so high. You wanted to inflate, and it essentially was a commitment mechanism that said, you know, with this much debt, we'll have to inflate. And again, that goes back to the Leaper mechanism and what Tommaso talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to see inflation in Japan, which really by most metrics isn't high, it's only high by the Japanese standards, right? But you wanted to get out of inflation, you know, deflation and inflation near zero. You did get out of inflation near zero. So a good question is, what is it that you are complaining about?
That's a very good question. So I'm a macro theorist, as you know. So from a theoretical point of view, as you may know, there's a famous suggestion by Goethe and Refet to escape from the liquidity trap, which is to use the logic of the FTPR. So try to be irresponsible. So accumulate so much debt. Then according to the intertemporal budget constraint, you're going to escape from the liquidity trap, which is theoretically very true. And I respect that theory. But at the same time, I'm not really confident about how the real economy will react to that kind of policy. So that's the kind of large uncertainty facing myself and probably facing policymakers all over the world. So there's a kind of gap between the theory I love and the reality.
Fair enough. I hope we'll get to talk about this a lot more. With that, we turn to Dr. FAIA again.
So speaking about policy and what is different than the 70s, one has to be always very cautious in making predictions when things are still not so clear. So with all the caveats, I think I feel to say three things. I mean, mostly in relation also to expectations and my own work and so on and so forth. I mean, the first one is the role of communication. I think it is clear that contrary to the 70s, I remember when I was in schools, they were telling me that, in the 70s, Meltzer and Kuckerman were talking about the low transparency of the Fed, that the Fed was convinced that they didn't have to communicate and so on and so forth. I think that now there is a completely change in culture. So the role of expectation, how communication can affect and possibly be another tool is very, very different than the 70s. That's the first thing. The second thing that, as I said before, my hunch is that this time inflation is much less reliant on energy prices. They are a component, but not the only component. And there is much more, given the well-known increasing concentration and top 5 firms coordinating and driving everything and so on and so forth. I feel that there is a much bigger role of concentration and firm dynamic, so market dynamic into inflation. So as we were saying before, much of the inflation is fueled when firms coordinate on an equilibrium of all raising prices. But and we know that there has been an increase in markups and market concentration worldwide. This has been documented by many people. So then I wonder whether a second pillar of policy can be a sort of new deal. I mean, shall we tackle maybe market concentration and the way, that firms affect prices? I mean, I don't mean that we should go through the full Roosevelt control of prices. That is, I think, out of the table and out of the question. But if that type of coordination game is affecting a large part of inflation, should we think not only about short-term policy, but also long-run policy? The third word is on debt and fiscal policy. I think that, Tommaso's work was, very elegant and clear as usual. One additional thing we know of this heterogeneous agents model, not the one that specifically Tommaso used, which is a tank model, but more the Bewley model, is that Ricardian equivalence doesn't hold in the short run either, meaning that whenever there are Bewley shocks, even the permanent income households do not save so as to keep the budget constraint of the fiscal policy on balance. And one thing that we would probably, we would likely see in those type of models, assuming they are true, is that if fiscal policy is being expansionary, one thing is the transfer, as Refet was saying before, across agents, that is neutral. But once you do expansionary fiscal policy, there are unintended consequences, which is the fact that the Bewley agents save less and consume more. And this leads to further inflation spirals. So I think one issue with debt and fiscal policy is even simpler than, we don't even have to go and entertain with the time inconsistency, which will certainly be there. But even in the short run, it's having unintended consequences on certain type of the population consuming more. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that hand to mouth is not only the poor, like it was at the times of Keynes and the second industrial revolution, but now a lot of the hand to mouth are rich, and they have, like, as Pei was saying in his own discussion, there are, their consumption is driving much of the business cycle.
All right, great. With that, I think we have had a wonderful panel, and this, I have to say, is as good as any 2 hour of macroeconomics gets. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm extremely grateful to all of the speakers. And I'd like to especially thank our hosts at RIETI for diligently organizing such a wonderful panel where everything flowed so excellently. I'm happy to conclude this panel and turn it over to Akiko-san.